Hi, everybody. All right, this is the partner chat to the how to start conversation that we had last time. We're going to be talking about how to end. And so I think importantly that endings are either on some kind of revelation or some kind of very strong, poignant, bang ending, but that those are actually not as common, nearly as common as ending on some firm sense of bringing it all together with your themes, lessons learned, or sometimes a longer denouement that needs to happen after a big, it doesn't even have to be epic. It could be any kind of conclusion, but lots of times people want to see after that, final climax point, whatever it might be, that things are okay. And so sometimes you don't want to end with that big bang, but rather a sense that after the fact things continue, or that your life changes in some way, or just that you're fine, right? Because a lot of times, especially with traumatic stories or things that are very hard, the reader wants to see a little bit, and I'm not talking about, much time, but some time of you living a life or having some kind of conclusion to that difficult part of the story that shows a different, softer sense that things turn out okay for you. So with themes, and we did talk about theme a bit last time, because I think that themes can be a great way to start. They're a really important thing with regard to holding the whole story. And theme is just so important generally to drawing conclusions and uh, doing reflection. And so theme is always a great way to end your story because it holds the reader in this idea. Yes, we've been talking about this topic or this idea the whole time, and we're going to end on it as well with a sense of conclusion. And that can be very satisfying and doesn't have to pack a punch or have some big bang ending. Sometimes people, I do want to acknowledge, are still living their story. Sometimes endings change because you're finding your way through it right now. I've seen this happen a lot of times, both by design and totally unexpectedly, where people, because the longer they take to write their memoirs, something happens and it changes everything. And then all of a sudden there's a new conclusion to the story. And so staying open to that possibility is a big one. One example of that is actually a She Writes Press author who was doing an adoption story, and then her son died. The adopted son died, and she decided that needed to be the end of the story. It sort of changed everything and gave her this different way of looking at what had happened. And of course, if she had published the story 2 years earlier, it would have been a completely different ending. And so that does happen. Sometimes, let's see. Oh, I want to just say, about considering the denouement, I had written denouement. I had written two examples. One is a story I love to tell or reference. It's called Bringing in Finn. It's a book that I've probably referenced to this group several times because it has a very perfect narrative arc. It's the story of a woman whose mother actually carried her son to term, and I did this book when I was at Seal Press. And the reason I love it is because if you're looking at just a total classic memoir arc, it's about trying to get pregnant, having multiple miscarriages, kind of deciding and finding out that her 60-year-old mother, in fact, could carry her and her husband's sperm and egg, the embryo, to term. The baby is born, right? Epic final climax. He's okay, bringing in Finn. And then we need to see how they're all doing afterwards. If she had just ended it there on the climax, I mean, yay, yes, it worked. The baby is born, and that's a huge deal. But that couldn't be the end of the story because we needed to see what happens with mom slash grandma, right? How does the mother do with the fact that she hadn't carried her child, and what happens after the fact? And so we get some life lived after the epic climax to see what happened with the family. Also, more famously, which people have probably read in here, is The Glass Castle. Jeanette Walls chooses to do basically an entire fourth part of her book, which serves as a larger conclusion, right? That brings us well past coming of age, because the book takes place from approximately age 3 until she's a young woman. But then the last part of the book is something like, 25, 30 pages of her being in her late 20s. And so she skips almost a decade to show us what happens later, because what she needed us to see was that her mom is rifling through the trash, and it is this, upsetting but also telling moment. And if she had ended it earlier than that and we hadn't seen this sort of homelessness, sad, challenging part of the end of Jeanette's parents' story, it again would have been a very different kind of story. And so that was a choice. Another person who does that very well is J.R. Moringer in The Tender Bar. His story ends, it's also coming of age, but then he lived in this part of the country that was very close to downtown Manhattan, and a lot of the men who were from his hometown ended up dying in the Twin Towers attack. And so that was important that he ended the story on this epic moment that had this sense of collective memory for all of us. And it happens much later in the story. So some of you might want to have a story that ends, and then you might pull us forward a year, 2 years, 10 years. It really depends on what is that wrap up thing that you need or want to show to the reader, and what kind of importance does it have. And it could be to your personal story, or it could be to something more societal or national or global. I also wanted to bring up Cheryl Strayed and Wild, because she does an interesting thing at the end of her book. Some of you might remember where she projects into the future, right? Cheryl Strayed's character, young Cheryl, finishes the Pacific Crest Trail and she ends somewhere in Oregon. I think it's near the Bridge of the Gods, right? And she says, "This is where, I will have my future. I will have children. I will get married. I will." And that was a choice to project into the future using the future tense. And it's quite poignant because you never leave Cheryl's present tense body, but she tells you what will happen from there, so that it doesn't leave you hanging at just like, yay, I finished this hike and I'm all good. See you later. We want to know that she ends up having a family and again, being okay, right? After this intense grief journey. So lots of different ways to do that. You can literally pull people into a future moment with a scene. You can project forward using the conditional or the future tense. And some of you might want to have more of a teaching moment. Some of you might want to be very strongly in scene. But as you move toward the ends of your story, I recommend just reading ends of other stories. How are people doing what they're doing? What resonates with you? What feels like a good way to bring it forward? You do not have to have an epilogue. That is a choice. It's a stylistic choice. It's wonderful. I love epilogues, but not every book needs to have one. And what I would say is, if you are planning to end your story on that bang moment, just ask some beta readers, does this feel conclusory? Do you need a little bit more later? Or if you're going to end on one of those bang moments, maybe you do need to have an epilogue that brings us slightly into the future to just say, okay, resting with this way that I ended the story, in a rush, or with this big climactic moment, here's where I am a year later and everything is, okay or different or the same, whatever it might be. So hopefully these two back-to-back beginnings and endings will help along the way. Appreciate all of you.